good morning, depending upon your geography at the moment. And Candace, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to spend some time talking about something that is some things that are near and dear to my heart, being data management as one, and then coastal and ocean monitoring systems. And I'll also point out, Candace referenced my association with the University of South Carolina, where I sit with the Arnold School of Public Health. And what has been the one constant in my career has been NOAA's National Estuarine Research Reserve System. So I've had the privilege of having an association with the NOAA NERRS for about 30 years now. And so a lot of the lessons learned and the discussion points today will come from some of those experiences. So I want to begin with a question, and I'm not going to provide the answer to the question right now, but I hope by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to answer the question. And the question is, what is a key component in understanding the relationships between the Deepwater Horizon incident of over a decade ago, ecosystem services, allostatic loading, and criminal domestic violence in coastal communities? So a bit of hopefully a thought-provoking question that may make a little more sense as we move forward. So the outline for today is we're going to talk about environmental data management, and then an overview of some of the coastal and ocean monitoring programs with which I've been engaged, and end with some examples of the power of integrating monitoring programs and sound science to inform decision-making at the community level, making a societal difference. With the objectives, or the primary objective is hopefully at the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of what are the 4 key requirements for realizing the full value of your monitoring data to address societal needs. So first off, I'll start with the first key component, an environmental data management program. And so why do we do environmental data management? Here's a reality that exists. A lot of folks are underwhelmed by their understanding of the environmental data that are out there, or they may be overwhelmed by the data that are out there. And we want to talk a bit about how a robust end-to-end data management program can assist both those that are underwhelmed and those that may be overwhelmed. So why do we do environmental data management? And I'll point out, over the course of my career, back in the early days, environmental data management was often an afterthought. There wasn't a whole lot of upfront consideration given to the need for environmental data management. But back in the early 90s, the federal government made a determination that we needed to do a better job with managing our data. And so the federal directive or executive order came out that requires federally funded organizations and projects to do environmental data management. Second, it makes sound financial and resource management sense. I suspect everyone that is on this webinar has experienced budgetary issues over the last number of years, and oftentimes we see our budgets being strained and pulled in a variety of directions, and often at the expense of our monitoring programs. And so having a robust data management program in place and the willingness to share our data provides greater access to more data for everyone. Third, it may be your job's on the line, and especially when folks beyond your own little cubicle, so to speak, begin to utilize your data and decisions are being made, then the quality of the data comes into play. And I'm going to come back to this slide in just a minute. So I want to point out the 5 key components of a data management program. And there are a lot of efforts out there today that suggest they're doing data management, but I would argue oftentimes they're doing a component of data management. So a true, robust, end-to-end data management program includes each of these 5 elements. The user needs assessment, i.e. we have to understand the needs, the capabilities, the constraints and limitations of those collecting the data and those using the data. There has to be a data collection protocol, a data collection protocol that is well documented. We have to have a quality assurance, quality control component. And it's not just that we have one, we have to implement it and we have to adhere to the QA/QC procedures. Then program documentation and the associated data documentation or metadata are critical. And they're extremely critical when we begin to talk about the use of our data beyond the reasons for which the data were originally collected. And in order for our data to achieve their fullest utility beyond our individual programs, we have to have the documentation and metadata which describes A, B, and C in great detail. And then data access and archival. If we can't access our data both today as well as in the future, then we might question the utility of our efforts. So these are the 5 components of a data management program. Now, I want to go back to the earlier slide, and your job may be on the line. Too often, data management takes place behind a desk, and I will offer up that data management has to take place within the hands of those that are most intimate with the data, those that are engaged in the monitoring effort, in the data collection efforts. You can't do data management without including those that are most familiar with the data. And what is displayed on the screen are 3 real-world examples of what could happen, the type of misunderstanding that could take place if you're not fully aware of your data, the setting in which your data were collected, why your data were collected, when your data were collected, etc. And you've got to document this. So the graph up on the upper left is bacteria loading data from an estuary in South Carolina where I do a whole lot of work. In particular, following the establishment of the Clean Water Act in 1972, we saw increased residential development along this estuary. Associated with that, we saw increases in bacteria loading. And the assumption was it was tied to all the septic systems in the area. So funding was secured to establish a municipal wastewater treatment facility with the expectation that once we had the wastewater treatment facility in place and everyone hooked up to it, we would see declines in bacteria loading. The system came online right about 1980, and as you can see from the graph, we didn't get the expected outcome. In fact, we see an increase in bacterial loading. And so people were scratching their head and saying, well, what happened here? Unbeknownst to a lot of folks that may not have been resident within or adjacent to this estuary, at the same time that the municipal wastewater treatment plant came online, we also finished construction of navigational jetties. And an impact of the navigational jetties was the fact that it decreased the inflow of fresh ocean water by about 20%. So we had decreased flushing, and that was what was resulting in seeing these higher levels, and not anything associated with the wastewater treatment plant or the residence itself. But if you're not familiar with the setting, you wouldn't know what was going on. the data table at the bottom is from another study site. And if you take a second and look at the day that these data were collected, the time that these data were collected, and the dissolved oxygen values. And you notice that there was, at one point, there was a significant decrease in dissolved oxygen. And so this was a study site many, many, many miles removed from Silver Spring, Maryland. But there were folks in Silver Spring, Maryland looking at these data and trying to figure out what was going on, what occurred. If you did not know that there was a small community right upstream from this monitoring station whose primary means of dealing with waste was a big lagoon, and that every New Year's Eve they had a community celebration that was the cleansing of the community, and they would flush out that lagoon right at midnight. And so what happened here was there was a big plume of pretty nasty water that moved over the sampling location, resulting in the decrease in DO. Again, if you weren't intimate with the setting and or you did not document this, you wouldn't be aware of what was going on. The third example, unfortunately, really hits home to me, and this is the site of our North Inlet Winnebago Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. There was an interest a number of years ago to do a beach renourishment project to the north of our reserve, and an interest in using an area at the mouth of North Inlet as the sand borrow site. So our state coastal zone management agency, our reserve, or the Baruch Institute at the University of South Carolina, and NOAA were all contacted for asking for the delineation of our reserve. And this speaks to the issue of having an authoritative database. So our university provided a reserve boundary, our state CZ agency provided a reserve boundary, and NOAA provided a reserve boundary. And lo and behold, they were not all one and the same. And in fact, two of the boundaries suggest that the area that was of interest for sand was outside of our reserve, and one shows that it was inside our reserve. The reality is one of these shape files is actually the buffer area for our reserve and not the core area. And the two that are most similar actually represent what happened when we went from single precision computing to double precision computing. And we increased the accuracy and actually the size of our reserve. So lacking a robust data management program, these are the type of issues that you can incur. So it's very critical to have a data management program. So the National Estuarine Research Reserve, as I indicated, I've had the opportunity to work with this system for going on 30 years now. And for those of you that may be unfamiliar, it is a state, federal, or private federal partnership within NOAA. We now have 29 sites around the U.S., stretching from Ketchimak Bay, Alaska, down to the Tijuana River, south of San Diego, across the Gulf of Mexico, Hobos Bay, Puerto Rico, two on the Great Lakes, and a slew of reserves up the Atlantic seaboard, including one that is quite close to former President Bush's compound in Kennebunkport. And these are amazing places that represent a variety of biogeography around our country, stretching from Ketchimak Bay up on the left to Rookery Bay at the lower right to Narragansett to the upper right, and I believe that may be one of our West Coast reserves on the lower left. So you can see there's a variety of landscapes, ecosystems, ecologies in play here, to my favorite, which is a Spartina-dominated estuary right here in South Carolina. So a number of years ago, stretching back to about 1994, there was a recognition and a realization within the NERRS of the importance of a monitoring program, an estuarine monitoring program. And so on what turned out to be the coldest week of January 1994, 1995, we sat around and established the system-wide monitoring program. And the point I want to make about this is that our swamp monitoring program, consistent with almost all monitoring efforts I've ever associated with, were designed for a specific purpose. And SWMP was designed to identify and track short-term variability and long-term changes in our estuaries. That was and is the primary purpose of SWMP. Within SWMP, we developed a very consistent protocol for the collection of our data. So every single reserve collects the same data in the same manner, using the same protocols, using the same equipment, etc. And this allows for both intra-estuarine comparisons as well as inter-estuary comparison around the country. And SWMP focuses on monitoring water quality and weather. So at each of the reserves, you can see the water quality parameters that are collected as well as the weather. And so each reserve has a minimum of 4 water quality stations and 1 weather station. We also do nutrient analysis, and so we have at each reserve we collect these nutrients, and we have additional swamp efforts that are ongoing. We have habitat mapping taking place, we have biomonitoring, and sediment elevation measurements. These latter 3 are not yet core components of SWMP, but we are moving towards implementing them as core components also. So the water quality, nutrients, and weather are the core of our SWMP monitoring efforts, and these latter 3 are being developed. So one of the other components of SWMP that was established at the outset or the onset was the recognition of the importance of data management. We wanted to ensure that the NERRS program was providing the highest quality data there was. And so the Centralized Data Management Office was established. And I will point out that a lot of thought was given to the name Centralized Data Management Office as compared to the Central Data Management Office. And our reasoning or rationale was central refers to a singular location. Centralized refers to an approach or a strategy. And we argued that central was not correct because we were going to require that data management be coordinated and organized, but also take place at each of the reserves. So centralized means we have a singular approach to our data management, but the activities are distributed. And so these are the objectives of our Centralized Data Management Office, or CDMO. And we take a lot of pride in the quality of the data. Oftentimes, data QA/QC is limited to what we can do on the fly. What can we automate and do some automated QA/QC, which is a fantastic start, but I will argue that these automated processes tend to take the responsibility for QA/QC out of the hands of the data collectors and the data providers. So within the NERRS, we have a three-step process to our QA/QC, including the automated QA/QC process, which is the primary review. Then we have provisional data, where we have brought in the individual reserves for the second level review. And then we have our authoritative data. Once we are absolutely sure that we have reviewed each and every data point and have documented whether we have data omissions, errors, anomalies, etc., all of that is well documented for all of our SWMP data. And when I bring up the point that we review every single data point that we collect, you can see from this slide, it's a pretty monumental task that we undertake. And so with our centralized data management office, we have a staff of approximately 7 people that are engaged in all aspects of our data management program, but in particular with the data QA/QC, and they work with the SWMP technicians at each and every reserve on the data QA/QC and documentation process. And therefore, we're pretty proud of the quality of the data that we're able to provide access to. The second key component or critical requirement is being able to make data available as quickly as possible. A lot of, as we'll see in a bit, a lot of the utilization of SWMP data is tied to those data that are made available in near real time. And NERRS was able to work within NOAA a number of years ago, and the Hydrometeorological Automated Data System folks, which is a very small entity within NOAA. I think the last time I met with them, they had a total of maybe 5 or 6 staff members. And it is one of, if not the most efficient federal entity I have ever worked with. And the heads folks were able to move NERRS ahead very quickly in our ability to take data from the field to making it available to a number of users. And this walks us through the process by which we make our data available. And we're very fortunate that as a NOAA partner, we can utilize the GOES satellite system for the telemetry of our data. Now, taking the next step, I've talked about the NERRS SWMP, a monitoring program that was established for a specific reason, to track the short-term variability and long-term change in our estuaries. Another umbrella effort that is out there is the U.S. Integrated Ocean Observing System. So IUS sits within NOAA, but IUS is much more than just a NOAA program. It is an assembly of efforts that take place. And under IUS, we have 11 regional associations that are responsible for coordinating data collection efforts. And I bring that up because I talked about the purpose of SWMP, and the purpose of SWMP was to collect data to help answer a question or address an issue. One of the strengths of the Integrated Ocean Observing System is that it promotes data assimilation. So IUS certainly does support the collection of some data, and IUS is establishing a reputation in particular with the work they do with HF radar along our coast. But I will state that a real strength of IUS is their efforts for data assimilation, and that supports making people aware of what data are being collected, where, when, how, etc. and supporting gaining access to those data. The third critical element is making people aware of what you're doing. So this is a very truncated list, partial list of users of our SWMP data. And our user list has expanded exponentially, to be honest, over the years as more people have become aware of our efforts and the quality of our data and the documentation of our data. So you need a data management program that is implemented, real-time data delivery, and advertising, promoting of what you're doing. Those are the first three critical elements to obtain the greatest societal value out of your data. I think it's also important to point out that data assimilation is not necessarily data integration. There's a lot of very useful, powerful data portals out there that support data assimilation, but we need to recognize that data integration requires that appropriate data integration requires that we have that data documentation, we have that database management program in place. So it's one thing to assimilate data, it's a very different thing to integrate data. And so what I want to talk about for the latter part and provide some examples of is the real value is in integrating across our observing systems. And so this is an example of an observing system that we have in South Carolina. And this represents meteorological or weather data that are collected by one of our state agencies here in South Carolina. And as you can see, it's a pretty limited geographical footprint of our coastal zone, and each of those stars represents where a weather station, an individual weather station, sits. This is an example of one of the data portals that assimilates data from a variety of sources. And you can see we've gone from, I think I only have access to 14 weather stations in the Grand Strand of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, to a realization that there's a lot more data that are out there. Coupled with, there's some really cool products that entities like the National Weather Service and others are now developing from remote sensing platforms. And the ability to integrate from a limited weather monitoring program in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, with efforts that the Southeast Coastal Ocean Observing Regional Association have identified and provided access to from their data portal, to NEXRAD data that we can extract from NOAA. Once we have access to this wealth of data and we have the documentation so that we understand why the data were collected, how they were collected, for what intended purpose were they collected, we can make the determination as to whether these data are useful and usable to address my societal issue or concern. So what I'd like to do now is just walk through a few examples of how we can integrate data from multiple observing or monitoring programs to inform our decision making. So the first is an effort that I've had the opportunity to be engaged with for a number of years, and it's tied to beach water quality. And I sit in a state where our economy is very dependent on tourism. I also sit in a school of public health where part of our responsibility is to protect and ensure the safety of our residents, our visitors, our constituents, etc. And concerns with exposure to bacterial-laden waters is both a public health concern and one of economic vitality. This was born out of a student project a number of years ago where I had a graduate student who was both a graduate student and she was also an employee of our state health agency and had responsibilities for the issuance of beach swimming advisories. The way in which we handled beach swimming advisories was if there was an event that took place, whether it was a routine monitoring event or a rain event, we would go out and take a water sample. We would send it off to the lab, and 24 hours later, we would get the results back. And from that, we would make a determination as to whether or not we needed to issue a swimming advisory. The problem with that is that we were potentially exposing people to bacterial-laden waters for a period of 24 hours. So we were issuing swimming advisories based on yesterday's conditions and data. The student who was involved with this was okay with that process until she had her first child. And she realized pretty quickly that she did not want her daughter or anyone else to be exposed to bacterial-laden waters when they were at the beach swimming. And so that's when we began to look at what data were available to see if we could develop preemptive models that would tell us when we're going to have water quality concerns. And over the years, we have gone from very limited data being available for this process to courtesy of a variety of efforts, including the NERRS and the IUS activities, to the realization that we have pretty robust data that are out there that can be ingested in real time to allow us to develop these models and run them in a preemptive fashion. So we now work within South Carolina, Florida, and we're moving into North Carolina, where we have preemptive models that on a daily basis provide information to public health, chambers of commerce, and resource managers in each of these states and to the general public as to the condition of the swimming waters, so that decisions can be made as to whether or not it's safe to swim. The goal being we're trying to minimize the vacationers from Ohio exposing their children to bacterial-laden waters and ending up at the local dock in the box. They can use a handheld app as represented in the lower right corner and take a look at what the water quality concerns are on that day and make a decision as to whether or not to swim or take advantage of the myriad of other tourism-based activities that exist in our coastal areas. This is an initiative that addresses both a public health concern and one of economic vitality and could not take place using a singular monitoring program. This represents the integration of data from a number of monitoring programs as represented in the box on the upper left. So public health and economic vitality supported by the integration of monitoring programs. The second is a project that began, golly, a number of years ago and was the brainchild of a lady by the name of Kathy Angel, who works with the reserve system in the Pacific Northwest. And she and her colleagues worked very closely with the Pacific Northwest Shellfish Growers Association, who needed access to monitoring data that allowed them to make decisions about when and where to harvest their shellfish. This started out as basically a $10,000 seed project a number of years ago that has grown into a very well-established partnership involving a number of data collectors, data providers, and data users in the Pacific Northwest. And I'll throw out a tidbit. I'm going to come back to this at the end to introduce what is the fourth critical element of ensuring the maximum use of your monitoring data to address societal needs. So we've gone from beach swimming and public health in the southeast to shellfish harvesting in the Pacific Northwest. The third is a partnership that includes the National Weather Service and the realization that mariners need access to dependable data and forecasts. And I will offer up, there are a number of very good commercial services that provide mariners access to real-time data and forecasts. Not everyone, though, has the equipment or the financial resources on their boats to have access to a number of the commercial products that are out there. So this represents an opportunity to provide critical data to a large segment of both the commercial and recreational mariner community. So the Marine Weather Portal initially began in the Southeast, supported by NOAA and the Southeast Coastal Ocean Observing Regional Association, has expanded into the Gulf of Mexico. And we actually have a meeting with the Weather Service this coming Monday to talk about how we're going to fine-tune this product so that it is geographically relevant at almost the level of a Charleston Harbor or a Winyah Bay or your favorite boating area. And this represents the assimilation of data that are collected by a wide range of data collectors and programs, many of which are funded by NOAA, but also those that are funded by state entities and the private sector, all partnering to address a societal need. Marine spatial planning, admittedly in some states, is a bit of a dirty word, but there's a demonstrated need for access to a variety of data in support of sound resource management and planning. And while the Governor's South Atlantic Alliance is now dormant here in the Southeast, the initiative and the identified value of and need for the assimilation of data from a variety of sources from the local level, which can be the county or a municipality, to the state level, to the regional level, to the national level, stretching from the offshore into the inshore to the onshore, is critical for sound planning. And so we have a number of GSAA-like activities that take place around this great country of ours. And then the value of our data goes beyond the bounds of where we're collecting it and even this country. And so we've had the opportunity to work with the European Environmental Agency on an effort for a global data assimilation. So on a global scale, we can start to look at potential trends and changes in environmental conditions and relate those to what might be, whether we want to talk about climate variability or global urbanization or any issue or factor that may be out there and is of interest or is of importance to public health, to safety, to economic vitality, etc. So we may be collecting data at a local level, but if we do it right and we document it, the value of those data can have global implications. So I want to bring this to a close and sum it up with these criteria to consider. And I encourage each and every one of us who is engaged in the collection of environmental data or just data in general to ask yourself these questions. Do your monitoring data have relevance to local, to regional, to national information needs? And I suspect if you can't answer a resounding yes to that, the long-term viability of your monitoring program may be called into question, because we really have to demonstrate the value of our monitoring programs beyond the bounds for which the data were originally collected. So does your monitoring program have a well-designed and adhered to data management program? And hopefully the answer is yes. Do your data have demonstrated use in management decisions? I just walked through a couple of examples, and I can tell you within the reserve program, we do an annual assessment of the use of our swamp data to address issues beyond looking at short-term change and long-term variability or vice versa in our estuaries. So the demonstrated use of our data to address issues beyond the primary reason the data are being collected is taking place. Do we have the funding? Sure, we have funding for our monitoring programs, but we can always argue that we could always use more funding. And I say that and go back to one of my earlier slides where I talked about the value of being able to communicate, cooperate, and collaborate to share and integrate our data across multiple observing systems to help address our funding challenges. And do we have the ability for leveraging to assist with scale up or even scale down? And I walked through a number of examples that went from local to regional to national to international scales. And so I would argue absolutely. Now, the last point I want to leave you with goes back to the four critical requirements that you need to have in place in order to maximize the use of your monitoring data to address societal needs. We need the data management program. We need rapid access to data, i.e. real-time data access. We have to make people aware of our data. And then the last point, and I'll emphasize this point with a quick story. Going back to the program we had with the national, with the Northwest Pacific Shellfish Growers Association, Sunday morning, the Sunday after Christmas, about 7, 8, it may have even been 10 years ago now, I am sitting at my little place in West Virginia on a snowy Sunday morning, and about 9:30 that morning, I get a call from one of the shellfish growers in Washington State or Oregon State. And he was calling quite upset. He wanted to know where his data were. He had gotten up that morning and he was expecting that the water quality data that he relied on every day for his decision-making process would be there, and the data had not been delivered that Sunday morning. Therefore, he could not make his decisions as to when and where to harvest his shellfish, and he wanted to know what the heck I was going to do about it. And I just kind of sat there and stared at my phone with the realization that I'm sitting in West Virginia. The data are being collected in Washington and Oregon. They're transmitted to South Carolina and then sent back to him. And we had a failure somewhere along the way. It was winter break for our university. We closed down for 2 or 3 weeks. and he wants to know what I'm going to do to get his data to him. So we had the aha moment, or the realization that once someone or an entity or an organization begins to rely upon your data in their decision-making process, whether you have the support of or the backing of maintaining a truly operational system, those people who have begun to rely upon your data, they consider you to be an operational system. And so we realized pretty quickly that even though we were not funded to be an operational 24/7, 365 days a year up and running system, people were relying upon access to the data to make decisions that impacted their daily life. And so that is a take-home that each and every one of us needs to be cognizant of as we consider the expanded utility of data that we are collecting for our monitoring efforts. And with that, I will stop. And thank you very much for the opportunity to provide data management and environmental monitoring from my experiences and perspectives. And I'll turn it back over to Candace and open it up for questions.